Hello everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at Mailkick. This gem is going to allow us to create email subscriptions for our users. Now this is a little bit different than just having a basic form that collects emails when you visit a web page. So something like if you go to a website, sometimes they'll ask you to sign up for their newsletter. Like here, I have this email form that says, do you want to subscribe to the newsletter? If I enter an email, that'll then be subscribe to it. I can then unsubscribe from my email account by doing that. That's not tied to a user account, however. Today we're going to be setting it up where maybe you have a newsletter and you also want to grab some info from your users to sign up for some specific thing where you know that these converted users are going to be very valuable, so you want to custom tailor for them. In that case, you can set up a button like this. Let me unsubscribe real quick, where you just have a quick little newsletter blurb that says, hey, if you sign up for a newsletter, you can get the latest news and announcements. And then the user can sign up, and then you can, from your dashboard, click a button that will then email the users, and they'll get an email that looks something like this, where it's your email blast or whatever, and then it specifically emails all those users. So we're going to set up a workflow like this. There is also, because this is a Andrew Kane repository, there is also the Ahoy gem. If we come over here, we can see the Ahoy email gem, which is going to work for getting analytics. Now we'll cover this in a future video, but for this one specifically, I just wanted to cover the email subscriptions. So to set this up, let's go ahead and let's stop our server, CD out of here, and scroll in a bit, and then we'll do a Rails new video, and we'll go ahead and we'll CD into it, and we'll run a code dot, open this up in VS Code. So we're going to be skipping the Bootstrap. I have Bootstrap in this application, but as I was building out the app, I realized that there's really nothing to be gained from it. We can just use button twos instead of using a Bootstrap class, because that's just a bit of overhead. And at the end of the day, you don't really care about styling. But to add this, what we're going to do is we'll start with the devise stuff, which is just going to be a bundle add devise. Devise. We can then do a Rails G devise :install command, and we can do a Rails G devise user command, just like this. That's going to allow us to install devise and generate our user account. We can then go ahead and do a bundle add for Mailkick real quick, which will create our Mailkick gem. There is going to be a Mailkick install command that we can run, which will be a Rails G, I think it's Mailkick :install. Hopefully, there we go. And that'll create our migrations for us. So we can come over to our DB folder and migrate, and the latest migration. I'll hit Control+ so you can read this. You can see in here, all it does is sets a list of subscribers, creates the list, has some timestamps, and then it has the index for the Mailkick subscriptions. So this is pretty much it, right? Now, what this is going to allow us to do is come into, let's say, our models and our user model right here. And if we come over to the gem, we can check real quick. We just have to add has subscriptions to our user model. So we'll go ahead, we'll paste this in, and we'll save this. This will then allow us to call user.subscribe or unsubscribe for whatever newsletter name we want to use. Now, this could be a model itself. You could have a Rails G model newsletter with a name of type string. Go ahead and run that. And then you could use this as your newsletter names. So then instead of doing user.subscribe, you would do something like let's do a Rails S real quick. Go over to localhost port 3000. If we go over to /user/sign in, click sign up, and sign up as dean@example.com with a password of password. You can then go ahead and stop your server. We can do a Rails C, and then we can do a user equals user.first, and then we can do a user.subscribe. I think this is what it is. Let's come over here and check real quick. Check real quick. It's user.subscribe. And this will be a subscribe to whatever we want to do. So we'll say newsletter.create with a name that is email blast. And now we can do newsletter equals newsletter.first. And then we can do a user.subscribe to the newsletter, right? That's what we called it, newsletter.name. So that will create a subscription to the email blast newsletter. So we can see right here, Mailkick subscribers, subscription type, etc. Our type is a user, our ID is 1, and our list, that's our email list, is email blast. So now when we email the email blast newsletter, it will go to this user. And the way we can do that is in here, there's going to be a thing to, maybe it's not in here actually. This might have been something that I made myself, which is giving myself far too much credit. It sounds a lot cooler than it is. But basically what you do is you can grab your list of users. We'll say at users equals user dot subscribed to the newsletter dot name. So we use the name again to just grab the list of users, and then our @users.count is of course going to be 1. But we can then do something like a user mailer dot with the user, which will be, each user as we iterate through them. So we'll just say user for this one. And then we can call email blast, where we pass in our user, and we have to pass in our newsletter.name. And then we can call .deliver later. Now we don't have this email blast yet, so this isn't going to work, but that's the basic idea of what we're going to do here. So let's go ahead and let's do this real quick. Let's generate a controller for our pages and our homepage. And then let's go ahead and let's generate a controller for our newsletter. Just like that. It's going to be pretty simple, pretty contrived, but this will be good. We'll go ahead and we'll run a Rails S real quick. And we need to generate our email blast mailer. So let's do a Rails G mailer for the newsletter. And we'll give it a email blast action, just like that. So that'll go ahead and create our mailers for us inside of our app views. Now we can do a Rails S for realsies this time. And if we come over to our config and our routes.rb, we can go ahead and set this up. So in our routes.rb, what we want to do, and I'm going to copy this because you don't want to see me type all this, we'll set up the home and the root path real quick. So we just have a route to pages and the home action. And then we need to create a couple things. Now there's 2 different options for this. So we'll say option 1, and then we'll do an option 2, and then we'll have other stuff. So you can just ignore the other stuff. For option 1, you can create 2 different routes. These will be a post to the newsletter subscribe action. This will go to newsletter subscribe as newsletter subscribe. And you can also do a delete to the unsubscribe, where it just corresponds to those. This is good. It's going to require you to have 2 different buttons. One's going to be a subscribe button, and one's going to be an unsubscribe button. The other thing you can do is you can just have like a manage route where you just post to a newsletter/manage, which goes to newsletter/manage. In here, you'll just check if the user is subscribed. If they are, then you're going to unsubscribe. And if they're unsubscribed, then you're going to subscribe. So I'll show you how to set both of these up because it doesn't take too much time. Let's come up to our app views, our pages, and our homepage real quick. In our homepage, what we want to do is real quick just set up what we usually have, which is our user signed in stuff. So this is just going to allow us to sign in with Devise. Once we have that, we can then go ahead and create a quick little render for a managed newsletter button. Now you can change this if you want to a, just like unsubscribe or newsletter sharing thing. But we'll start here. We'll say new folder. We'll call this shared. Inside of our shared folder, we'll create a new file. We'll call this the, let's say, _newsletter.html.erb. And then inside of this newsletter, we'll just create a quick little div with a ID of newsletter. You can then go ahead and close that. And then in here, we can do our link. So the link's going to look like this. It's going to be a newsletter, says sign up, blah, blah, blah. Has a button to subscribe, which goes to our newsletter subscribe path, which is going to be our newsletter subscribe path right here. So this is for posting. So you can click subscribe. It'll create a new subscription with a method of post and a data turbo method of post. Now, the question is, what if you're already subscribed? Well, in that case, what we can do is we can just, say, if you're already subscribed, let's do a button to unsubscribe. Else, we'll do the newsletter section right here, and then we can do an end right here. So if we save this and save our homepage right here, we can come over here and refresh, hopefully. And it's going to tell us we don't have this managed newsletter thing right here. So in this case, I need to actually change this to be just the newsletter partial because we haven't created that. And now we can refresh. So we can see right here, we're already subscribed because we did that through the console, right? So let's go ahead and let's click unsubscribe. And if we refresh, you'll see an error here where it's going to tell us the action was not found. So let's go ahead and let's create these actions in our controller real quick. We'll come up to our our controllers and our newsletter controller. And in our newsletter controller, what we want to do is a couple things. So first things first, we need to authenticate our users. If we ever get here, we're assuming they're already signed in. Now we're going to have a couple actions that are going to require getting our newsletter name. So let's just go ahead and click set name where we do all of these things. Now we'll do those at the bottom in a private section. So we'll just come down here. We'll have the newsletter params, which takes in the name, the method, and the authenticity token, just because I don't have a require here. It's just a quick little button. And then we can set the name based on the parameters we pass back. Now this can change. I'm going to use a hard-coded string, but you could also use that model we created if you want to. But okay, now what we use these for is creating a subscribe and an unsubscribe path. So for the subscribe method, we're going to have a current user.subscribe to the @name, which we set down here. And then we only do this unless the current user is already subscribed. If the current user is already subscribed, then we don't have to call this subscribe thing. We then respond with a TurboStream or an HTML, depending on what came our way, right? So we also have the exact same thing for the unsubscribe, except we change this to unsubscribe, and we do it if the current user is subscribed. So this one uses unless, this one uses if, everything else is going to be the same. And this is where I meant having something like a manage actions a bit better, just because you can have something like a quick little manage where it checks if the current user is subscribed, then it calls unsubscribe, else it calls subscribe, because those are your only two choices, and then it responds just like in the other cases. So all three of these look similar. It's just you can kind of condense these two into this one check, and then you're good to go here. Really depends on how you want to do it. But we'll go ahead, we'll save this, and that'll give us our action. So let's come over to our homepage again, refresh, I'll hit enter, I'll click unsubscribe, and we can see in here, we have a delete from the Mailkick subscriptions. So now if we refresh, we have the newsletter right here. If we click sign up, or if we click subscribe, it will insert into, and then it'll be done. Now for both of these, you can see we don't have a template found for this. That's because we tell it to respond with a TurboStream. So let's go ahead and let's create that TurboStream so we can use Turbo, because it's always fun to do that. How do we do that? Well, it's going to depend on where the controller is. So in this case, we have this newsletter controller. We need to actually create these TurboStreams inside of our newsletter. So we'll right click, new file. I'll call this one the subscribe.turbo_stream.erb. And then we kind of need to do this a couple more times. So we'll go ahead and copy this, paste it, and then we'll rename this one to unsubscribe.turbostream.erb. And then we need one more where we're going to name this one the manage.turbostream.erb, because they have to correspond to whatever the action was in here. So we have a subscribe, unsubscribe, and manage. So in our views, we have a subscribe, unsubscribe, manage in our TurboStreams. So let's come into the subscribe real quick. Because of how we set this up in the view before, we actually have that div with an ID of newsletter. So we can just call a TurboStream.replace on that div with an ID of newsletter. We render a partial, which is going to be inside of shared, and it's going to be our newsletter partial. And then we pass in some locals, which are going to be the name, which is @name, and the user, which is the current user. So where's this @name coming from? Well, that is in our newsletter controller. We set this name in our before action, so we still have access to it. And then for our user, we pass in a current user. Because we're using Turbo, we actually can't use the current user inside of our shared thing right here. So this can't use a current user, has to use the user variable, which we also have to pass in from our home. So that's why we pass in a user right here and a name of email blast. Again, you could change this to just be like, what do we call this? The newsletter .first.name if you want to go that route, where you just use the model name right here as opposed to hard coding the string. But for the sake of this demo, we'll go with the hard coded version. If we come over here and we refresh, we can hit enter. If we click unsub, nothing's going to happen. But if we now refresh and click subscribe, you'll see Turbo is automatically updating this page. After it creates a subscription, it then says we now need to do the unsubscribe stuff. So let's go ahead into our unsubscribe TurboStream, and this is actually going to be the exact same thing as in our subscribe method. So if we do this, we can save it. It's going to be everything's the same. We refresh, we can now click unsub, and our newsletter will reappear. So just like that, we have Turbo working. But of course, we're replicating this logic. So what we ideally want to do is have like a shared one, which is just the manage TurboStream, which does the same thing, except it renders a partial called manage newsletter. So let's come into our shared, right-click new file, and we'll call this one _manage newsletter.html.erb. And then for this managed newsletter, it's going to look very similar to the other one, except, instead of using the subscribe and unsubscribe path, it's going to use the newsletter manage path. It'll pass in the name all the same. And that's pretty much it. We're using a post for both of these because it's just easier to work with. And if we do this, we can save our manage. And now we can come over to our homepage, home.html. We can change this to the manage, manage newsletter, I think is what we called it. Something like that. And now if we come over here and we refresh, we'll have the exact same text. We can click subscribe and unsubscribe, but we only have this one partial this one TurboStream that we're using. But okay, now how do we use the mailer itself? Well, there's a couple things we can know about how to use this here. The first one's going to be in our, I think in our homepage, we can have a button that says, let's email our users, which will take us to the email blast path, which means we have to create this. So let's come into our routes real quick. Inside of our routes, what we want to do is have this email newsletters path. So let's come down here and create that. It's going to be a post to newsletter/email because I'm unoriginal, and it just calls the newsletter email action. So let's come into our newsletter controller. Inside of our newsletter controller, what we want to do is have this email action happen. So what we'll do is we'll say def email, and we already added the email to our name up here because I got lazy and copy pasted the whole thing. So that's where we can use the @name from. So we'll say @users equals user.subscribed with the name. And then we can do, if we want to, we can do something like this where we put sending @name newsletter to @users.count so you know how many users you're emailing. And then we can do a quick little loop on these users where we say sending an email to the user. And then we call user mailer.with the user, which we're getting from right here. This is implicitly the same thing as this. It's just Rails is smart enough to figure out what it means without having the user variable there. It just matches it to whatever this is. We then have the email blast where we pass in a user, which is our user right here, and a @name, which is the name of our newsletter. And then we call .deliver later. So just by doing all that, and then adding a quick little bit at the end here where we redirect to the root path, we can now refresh our homepage and we have this email users button. So if we click it right now, we can scroll up and you'll see nothing really happened. If we subscribe though, it's going to be a little bit different because now we're going to have like a bunch of, or I guess we're going to have one user that we can email. So if we click email users, we're going to run into a uninitialized constant for the user's controller, which is our user mailer. So we have this, this user mailer, wherever this is, but I actually called it the newsletter mailer because I wasn't thinking. So we're going to change this to newsletter mailer, just like that. And then we can refresh in a second here. If we click email users, and if we hit F11, we should see an error in here because that method won't exist. So we'll see in here that the email blast does not exist. Or sorry, it exists, but it has the wrong number of arguments. So let's come into the newsletter mailer. And in here, we can go ahead and create this mailer real quick, which is just going to look like this. Now, for testing purposes, we're going to change this to just use the first user and have a name of email blast, or we could even do newsletter.first.name. And then in here, we just want to set the user and the name to be whatever got passed in because we're going to be using these variables. And then this actually needs to be the name is equal to this by default. There we go. So we're going to have the user and the name. We assign those so we can use them as variables. And then we just leave the rest of this to just email the user.email. Now, what this is going to allow us to do is come into our newsletter mailer and we can look at the HTML, for example. It's going to be the exact same thing for the text version. But now we can actually use the user's email in here. So this @greeting is set to the text hi. So it's going to say hi, comma, whatever. We can just insert our user email. So now it'll say hi, dean@example.com, find me in the blah, 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 nobody cares. We can also include a unsubscribe link in here because we don't want to get sued into oblivion. So we say link to unsubscribe, and this is actually a path Mailkick provides for us, which is the Mailkick unsubscribe URL, where we pass in the user and the mailing list that they're on. So we can come over here and we can refresh. We can click email users, and this should, because we're subscribed, do something, but it's actually giving us an error here. So let me go ahead and hit enter a couple times just to make sure that we are on the latest version. Now it's giving us the missing host link to. So for this, we have to come into our environments, our development.rb, because I always forget to do this. And we just have to really quick tell it that in development, it's using the default URL options of localhost and port 3000. When we change our environment, we have to stop our server and run a Rails S again. You can come over here and refresh, click email users, hit F11, scroll up, and now you can see the email in our console. It does come with a link right here, which is our unsubscribe link. So let's go ahead, and if I hit Control left click on this, it'll open this up in a new tab, and this is what your users would see, where you can see clicking on it automatically unsubscribes them. And then after they're unsubscribed, because you can see the delete thing right here, they can also click resubscribe. So if I hit enter, click resubscribe, you'll see it resubscribes me to it. But if I unsubscribe, come over to our homepage and refresh, it'll change to the newsletter. So this doesn't have the turbo stream on it, but that's fine. It's just dealing with this in the background. So that'll take care of that. If you ever want to customize this, I believe there's a way to generate these with the Rails G Mailkick views command. So let's go ahead and do that. Rails G Mailkick views, and then you'll see a Mailkick folder with a show action inside of it. which is an entire HTML file that has the subscription stuff in there. So we can say test case donuts in here if we want to, save it, and this will now display in our subscriptions tab. So if I refresh after I start the server again, this should hopefully take us to, oops, that's not it. There we go. The test case donuts, you are unsubscribed or resubscribed. So that's how you can modify this page as well. If you ever want to see what your actual emails look like with this mail previewer, this isn't going to work right now because it's the newsletter mailer, but you can test this real quick just by coming into your test. You can come into, what is it, test, it's going to be mailers, previews, newsletter, mailer, preview, and then in here there's going to be a link. If you click on this, it will open this up in a new tab. And because we have that default stuff set in our newsletter mailer right here with the user.first and the newsletter name, you can see those in here as well. So that's going to allow you to test this mailer if they have the default options. If you don't have the defaults in here, like you just have name and user like this, if we come over here and we refresh, this will throw an error because it has the wrong number of stuff in it. So that's why we did that. But this is going to allow you to very quickly have something set up where users can sign up or register for your newsletter, unsubscribe from it, etc., and then automatically have the links in your emails. All of that's handled for you. And because it's an Andrew Kane gem, you know that this is something that's going to actually be maintained because every time you see Ann Kane in the GitHub name, that's a guarantee of quality. But yeah, I just thought I'd cover this. It was a bit of a longer tutorial, but I wanted to properly cover how to set up, you know, a lot of different options for you. It's of course going to vary depending on how your individual situation is set up. These tutorials are always kind of like, you know, winged, where it's just a basic overview because I'm not here to do your job for you. If you're running a business, you do have to think sometimes, but hopefully you still got something out of this. Hopefully, you know, you're maybe more interested in setting something as daunting as this up. There is also an integration section in here if you go down to the bottom where they show you how to use the common integrations for you know, actually sending emails in production. So like SendGrid is one I've used before, where it tells you how to set up the services so that this can be handled for you. And then you would go to SendGrid, pay $10 a month or whatever for an API key, and then use that. But yeah, that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully this was informative and helpful, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.